we're looking at factors of production and how they contribute to economic development. Last time we talked about physical capital. Before we start, just the feedback from the previous lecture. Again, you rated the lecture 4.6 out of 5 in this block, factors of production in underdeveloped countries. Before I start talking about human capital, let's just very briefly see what we covered in the previous lecture. The quantity of capital is important, but the quality is important too. So we're talking here about productivity, not just the amount of capital you have. We explain what we mean by capital stock and different capital goods, and how development is associated with industrialization, and that requires capital accumulation. So as we said, we focus only physical capital. We didn't talk about human capital last week at all, but this lecture will be all about human capital. So, and then we move to discuss the different concepts related to technical progress. We try to understand how we measure or how we understand technical progress, or how societies progress. So we talked about different concepts. But first, we explained that there are high returns to investment in developing countries, and we explain why. But also on the other side, we talked about the risk. If you remember, there was like one of the graphs that show you the risk against the returns. And also we talked about how in developing countries, because they have low capital to labor ratio, then adding more capital, that probably will improve productivity. Okay. And the 3 ways we looked at technical progress, or explaining technical progress. You could look at this through the total factor productivity, or input saving technology, or R&D, research and development. So looking at this through the total factor productivity, if you look at the production function here, exactly what happened from moving from the blue production function upwards to the red one. This is due to technical progress that increased total factor productivity. So we explain what we mean by total factor productivity is that residual, or that increase in output that is not explained by that's not due to increase in input. So, and we explain, use the Cobb-Douglas function, how we can drive this. But even if you don't remember what we did to drive this, it's just very simple. The idea is just the difference, and anything related to knowledge that would the same amount of capital moving from this blue production function to this red one, that means using the same amount of capital will result in higher level of output. So that is that means total factor productivity has increased, or productivity increased. We could look at this through input saving technology, so which we can measure by capital output ratio. So given the same rate of given a certain rate of profit, so if technical change lead to lowers the capital output ratio, that means it's capital saving. If it raises capital output ratio, that means it's labor saving. If it doesn't change, if it leave it unchanged, so that means it's neutral. Or you could look at this through the marginal rate of substitution between the two inputs, the capital and labor. So technical progress or technical change will be capital saving if it raises the marginal product of labor in greater proportion than marginal product of capital. If it's going to be labor saving, if it does the opposite, neutral if it doesn't change this. We show these 3 graphs if you remember, and we finish by looking at the R&D. We talked about creating knowledge is different from applying knowledge, and is different from knowledge diffusion. So we said, well, knowledge could be transferred, okay, but the most important thing is the knowledge diffusion. So because this book questions on the motivation and willingness of societies to break custom with tradition and try new things. Try new things always come with a risk. And that's why it is important to have this sort of what we call entrepreneurs, or those who are risk takers, who are willing to try new methods, new ways of production, and deal with that risk. Okay? And that's what Schumpeter called creative destruction, where you have old firms that are no longer profitable, they shut down, they close down, and they enable resources to move to more productive process. The problem here is that poor countries, they actually lack this sort of spirit, this sort of risk-taking spirit. They are more risk averse. So this is everything, probably everything we discussed last lecture. So this is like mainly the main points in the previous lecture. The lecture recording is not online yet. Quick reminder, any questions related to the coursework, please to direct these to Kelvin. Now, let's move now to what we're going to discuss today. But as usual, before we start the new lecture, let's quickly go to Socrates and answer this question, which is related to what we covered in the last lecture. So please enter your email address and tell me on Socrates, what are the main means by which societies progress technologically? Okay, so today, as I said, we'll talk mainly about human capital, and I hope you will enjoy this one because it has really very recent material. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. But before we start it, talking about human capital, just want to see from what you know, what we mean by human capital. So the first question, what's meant by human capital, and why is it important for economic development? Just quickly, this is what I'm going to talk about today. Basically, I'm going to talk about why human capital is important for growth and how to measure human capital. Okay. Then I'm going to take only one element, which is education, and talk about this in a little bit more detail. But human capital has much more than this to talk about. Okay, so this is a very brief introduction to what we can cover about human capital. So if I start from the beginning, when we talk about economic growth or development, so we just need to think about what is the ultimate goal of economic activity, what we want to achieve from economic activities. We basically want to satisfy wants and needs. And to do this, we use the factors of production. We know all these factors of production now. We have 4 factors of production: labor, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and produce goods and services. So basically, labor is one of these inputs. But the same way I explained with capital, so it's not just the quantity, it is the quality. Okay? So when we talk about capital, we talk about the quality of workers, of that labor input. Okay? So labor is one of the inputs, okay, in the production process. And it is important to think about not only its quantity or the amount of labor that is available to any country, it's also important to think about the quality of this labor, which is human capital. That's what we're talking about. So this has been realized since Adam Smith. Adam Smith, in his writings, he always said like economic activity is fueled not by workers as a collective mass, but through acquired and useful abilities of all members of the societies. So he's one of the first economists that realized that workers' individual capabilities could be looked at or could be considered as capital or as an asset that could yield returns. So that's from early time of Adam Smith. However, this hasn't been like a formal way of thinking in economics before 1960s. So early growth models usually focus on how, or in explaining the relationship between different factors of production and how they affect economic growth, but they didn't really take much account of the education or the quality of labor. So they was thinking more about the quantity of labor. But since 1960s, there became like an agreement of the importance of people to economic growth. So when we talk about people here, we talk about abilities, we talk about knowledge, we talk about competencies. So which, in other words, it's human capital. Okay? So as I said, it's not easy to define, but if you think about all these abilities, knowledge, anything that can improve the quality of labor, that is part of human capital. So in other words, so it's everything, knowledge, skills, anything that people acquire during their lifetime. So it could be experience, could be something you acquire through training, it could be something you have through education, or it could be because you live a healthy life. So anything related to that is human capital. So you can define the human capital or the stock of human capital for any nation that way is the sum total of a population's health. Okay, so you need healthy workforce. Education, you need educated workforce. And skills, knowledge, experience, and habits. So that is what we mean by human capital. Okay, so all these together form what we know by human capital. Why? Because these determine the quality of labor, or the quality of the labor input. So if you think about this, healthy, of course, you need healthy workers, educated workers, skilled workers, knowledge, experience, and also habits. Okay, kind of the culture of hard working and ambitious, etc. You remember when we talk about developing countries like those who are risk takers, entrepreneurs, these are habits. These are part of the culture, yeah, the values. So it's not just education, health, knowledge, you need also habits to be more toward improving the level of human capital. This is one, Robert Solow is one of the those economists who wrote extensively about the importance of investing in human capital or improving human capital. I'm quoting from his writing here. He said, "Economists have long known that people are an important part of the wealth of nations." So this is something we already know from the past, and as I show you since Adam Smith, so we understand this very well. But they haven't stressed that individuals invest in themselves to improve their own personal economic returns. Remember when we talked about how Adam Smith think of human capital or labor, we said he think of this as a kind of asset that could yield returns. It's the same way. That's exactly what Robert Solow is saying. He's saying, well, people invest in themselves to increase or to improve their own personal economic returns. As an example, well, a student, when you are here, I said before, like, you're not here because you are concerned about the British or the UK workforce. Of course, having an educated workforce is important for economic growth in the UK, but this is not why you're here today. You're here because you want to have a better job prospects in the future. You're building your own career, so you're working to increase your economic returns. That's exactly what Robert Solow meant. There are different papers here, so you can read this paper if you wish. Okay, but it says exactly what I'm saying now. So the importance of investing in human capital, and he explained that people do invest in themselves. Of course, investment by individuals should yield improvement or should yield real improvement in real income and well-being, and there's actually one thing that we should have covered today, but we will not have time to cover, which is return to education. So a large body of literature talking about returns to education. So how much you would earn more if you gain or if you earn one extra year of education. Okay, so having, for example, a university degree compared to having a master's degree compared to having a PhD. So this is some sort of investment and should have some returns. Okay, as I said, we're not going to discuss this, but if you want really to read more about this, the textbook, I think it was chapter 7 on the reading list, I think, and at the end of this these slides also has a section on returns to education. But anyway, so this is something that we should understand. So the quality of human capital depends on health, education, and as we explained, skills, knowledge. Anything that could improve the quality of this human capital will contribute to economic growth. Jim Yong Kim, who's the president of the World Bank. He just, I think he resigned last month. So he was the president till last month. And this is like something he wrote about human capital gap and the gap between developed and developing countries. And I guess you're not surprised. There's a large gap between developing and developed countries. But what he said was interesting. He said that government invest in physical capital, but far less interested in investing in human capital. And that's a mistake. Okay, this is from his article, and he said that's a mistake because, of course, neglecting investments in human capital can weaken a country's competitiveness. Okay, and this is something I don't think it's very surprising. Okay, so there's a large gap between developed and developing countries, and we'll look at this now. We'll look at some statistics and some maps now, but it's something that shouldn't surprise you. Of course, there's a large gap in terms of human capital between developed and developing countries. So the question now, how to measure human capital? So how can we say there is a gap? Okay, how can we rank different countries according to the quality of their human capital? The World Bank, and as I said, this lecture has some very recent work by the World Bank. In October 2018, the World Bank launched the Human Capital Index, okay, which I do encourage you to look at this material and check what they have done. It's very, very interesting stuff. So what they want to do, they want to have construct a tool, like an index, that quantifies the contribution of health and education to the productivity of a country's next generation of workers. So start with children and see how much human capital a child born, for example, today, expect to acquire by age 18. So that's what they are trying to answer. Okay, so we'll know more about this index today, and all the figures and maps and statistics, all based on this, on the World Bank work. And there's like a paper which I cited at the end. I would encourage you to read it. So anyway, let's know more about, let's find out more about the Human Capital Index. So before we just jump to the details about this Human Capital Index, I hope now it is clear what we mean by human capital. Okay, is the quality of labor, or is the quality of the human capital? What matters is health, education, skills, knowledge, even habits. Okay. So moving forward, so they have data for, I think, 160 something. I'm not sure if this 157 is correct. I think it's 167 countries. Based on the education and health outcome and how this affect productivity. Okay, so there are 5 indicators they use to build this index. So basically what they have, they just look at these 5 indicators and try to use these to construct one index that varies from 0 to 1. Okay, so of course you move to the toward 1, that means better human capital. So please watch this later. So this is the, according to this, the most recent estimates they have. If you look at this world map, these are quartiles. So you look at the top quartile, which is this color, and then the second, the third, and the bottom quartile. So I don't think you're surprised to see Africa, for example. I don't know if that's clear. It should be clear. Yeah. So if you look at the bottom quartile, so just this is the bottom of the index. Most countries line in Africa, mostly poor countries. Third quantile, looking at Latin America and some Asian countries. And the top quartile, you look at mainly European countries and North American countries. Okay? So it's not very surprising. So we've seen this map in many lectures, different topics. We're talking about capital last time. We talked about agricultural productivity 2 weeks ago. And we usually see similar map like this. So explain why these countries are, why these developing countries are struggling, are lagging behind. So according to this index, this is the world map, and it explains really the differences in living standards. Again, the human capital has something to do with this, to explain this. So these are just some, it's like a summary of what the findings in this index. So advanced economies have human capital index value above 0.75, while emerging economies like India have 0.44. Singapore, by the way, comes first, top on this list, 167 countries, followed by South Korea, Japan, and Hong Kong, and US ranked 24th in terms of human capital. Okay, the UK is number 15. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa have the lowest human capital index. So we're talking about Africa and South Asia. They have the lowest index. African countries with low access to formal education, they have the worst ranking, and the worst ranking ever is like on the whole list is Chad and South Sudan. So they did something very interesting as well. They're using this human capital index to tell you what that means to productivity. So for example, in Chad, which is one of the worst ranking in the whole list, it tells you that productivity and earnings potential is 29% of their potential if they have better condition in terms of health and education. So they have got only 29% of their potential in terms of if compared to ideal conditions. When I talk about ideal conditions here, I talk about health and education. So earning potential in Singapore, so the same figure in Singapore, which comes on the top of the list, is 88% of their potential. In the US, is 76% of their potential. So a country like Morocco, it's like somewhere in in the middle, or really like not very high in the ranking, loses 1.4% of their annual GDP growth every year. Okay, again, that's compared to ideal conditions. So we talk about ideal conditions, having better education, better health, and how much you would achieve, or this country would achieve, if they are under this scenario or ideal condition. Also, there's like a warning by the World Bank, which you can read about, is about the wave of automation and artificial intelligence. We talked about this last time, if you remember. And I said this will have some implication to jobs and to workers. So some of the low-skilled jobs will disappear, okay? And this means will make it worse for countries like Chad or countries like mainly African countries or low-income countries. So the reason behind this, or why I'm showing you this is the most important thing. So to show you that human capital, so if you just for a second, just believe that this is a better way of measuring human capital, looking at child survival, school enrollment, so education, quality of learning, which is new, and I'll explain more about this quality of learning, how they do it, how they measure it, and health, healthy growth, and adult survival. So 5 main indicators. We believe that this is a better way of measuring human capital, which they do explain in this paper, so which I'm citing later on. Read that paper. So that explain exactly why we see this map, is exactly why these countries are poor, why these countries are lagging behind, is again is the quality of labor. So the question now, as I said, so there are different aspects to look at when you consider human capital. So it's not just education, but we look only at education today. So you should consider health, education, anything to do with skills, knowledge, etc. So, but as I said, we'll focus only or mainly about education today. So how can we measure the outcome if we want to say that country X is doing better than country Y in terms of education? So in the literature, they used to look at enrollment. Okay, so the percentage of the children in the school age that they are already enrolled, so they are already in school. So what we have here is the school enrollment, okay, as to primary schools as a percentage of gross. So that means of all the students or all children that who are on the age of school age. So you see, if you compare now where we are now from with what was the case in 1970, you see like upward, very clear upward trend. So what does that tell us? It tells us that it seems like education kind of most countries, this is the world by the way, so they take the average. So kind of is improving. So it's doing much better than 1970. But this is not the whole story. This is not everything, because this is, as I said before, when you average, sometimes it covers really so much. So it doesn't really tell you the full picture. So this school enrollment, again, primary by region. So we're not averaging here across the whole world. We averaging here by region. So if you look at, again, Africa and some parts in Asia, so it is really consistent with what we saw here. Okay, so again, it's about enrollment. So that means, if you look at this, for example, this red means that from 0 to less than 40%, only 40%, or less than 40% of the children school age that they are already enrolled. So that means 60% are not. Okay, nearly half or more than half, they are not enrolled. This is like a kind of old map, so it's like maybe there's much more, like there's more improvement than this, but it just gives you the idea of the school enrollment in different area, which is not really different from what we see today. So this is today, okay? But again, this is average by region. So in terms of school enrollment, as I said, it doesn't really tell the full picture, but you still can know something from it. You get something from it. So if we look at the children out of school, so children who are not in school, so we had, this is for the whole world, so we had 100 million children who were in age, school age, but they're not in school. That was 1992, 100 million, okay? And this figure dropped, you see, to maybe somewhere around 60 million by 2014. And these colors here explain to you per region where these figures come from, okay? So where they come from mainly? Africa, okay? So there's no surprises. So I feel like I'm not telling you anything new today, okay? Because it is consistent with what we've seen in the last lecture and the lecture before when we talk about agricultural productivity, when we talk about physical capital. So it's very, very similar picture, isn't it? So mainly it's Africa and some places in some parts of Asia, etc. Okay, so they contribute to this this sort of figure or this chart. Okay, so education is important. Okay, if you really want to improve human capital, so first thing you need to think of education. Obviously, health is important too, but as I say, we're not going to cover health today. We're not going to talk about health, but education is the other pillar or is the other dimension that you need to look at, and you need to improve the outcome. But the question here, which by the way, there's like another figure here or another map that show that pre-primary education, which is not universal again, so in most of Africa, that was before most children don't have pre-primary education. But this is the picture so far. So what I'm trying to say here is that, let's say, in terms of enrollment, there's some improvement. If you look at this figure here, or look at this chart, so this kind of the number of children out of school is declining. But what is even more is, well, let's put it that way. If a child goes to school, does it mean they are learning? So what we're looking at here is actually like something even worse than this when you consider the quality of education. Okay, what we have here, and that is the difference, and that's why I'm looking at this this recent work by the World Bank, because most of the literature, okay, most of the work that is done before mainly focus on enrollment. So assuming that you are enrolled, that means when a child is enrolled in a school, that means they are learning. But it doesn't have to be the case. And that's exactly what I'm going to show in the next half of the lecture. Okay? So enrollment doesn't necessarily mean they are learning. Okay? And that's exactly what the new index trying to capture. Okay? They're trying somehow to assess learning, not just enrollment. Okay? So in terms of enrollment, yes, there's so much work has been done to put more students, children in school, and this very clear here. Okay, so the number of children out of school is declining over time since 1992 till today, and it's still improving. But the question here, going to school doesn't necessarily mean that these children are learning. Okay, and again, this affects the quality of education, affect the quality of human capital, and obviously that affects productivity and economic growth. So what we're gonna see after in the second half is how the World Bank, how the new measure capture this and what it shows us. Okay, do you have any question about the first half? So okay, let's start again. So as I said, from what we saw in the first part of the lecture, we know that human capital is more about the quality of humans or of labor, which include health, education, skills, knowledge, even habits. Okay? And we try to focus only on education. And as I said before the break, most work in the literature, most of the research will focus mainly on enrollment when it comes to education, when they try to measure educational outcomes. We saw some improvement in terms of the number of children out of focusing more on the declining trend of the number of out-of-school children. But as I said, there was some improvement, okay? And most of the literature use to measure human capital, they use schooling, so enrollment. So as I said, being in a school doesn't mean, or going to school doesn't mean you're learning. So if a child goes to school, it doesn't mean they are learning. It depends on the quality of education they receive. So, and there's a large gap, and it's not surprising to see this or to say this. There's a large gap between schooling and learning, especially in developing countries. Okay, so it's again mainly about the quality of education. I'm bringing here a few examples, and these examples If you look at some African countries, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, there's only 3/4 of grade 3 students cannot read a basic sentence. In rural India, half of grade 3 students cannot solve a 2-digit subtraction problem. Okay, so they are in school, but they are not learning. Okay, so this is very, very important. So when we measure schooling, when we measure human capital by only schooling or enrollment in particular, it fails to deliver really the sustainable growth rate that we wish for. So it's more about learning more than just enrollment or attending school, because this is based on the new measure, and this is the paper I talked about, Angus et al. 2019. As I said, it's February 2019, so it just came out this month. So please read that paper. It explains more detail about the index, how they construct it. But what I'm going to focus on today is just the learning one. So as I said before, so the enrollment seems to be going to the right direction, so going upward trend. By using the index, which is constructed by the World Bank for learning, it seems to be declining, not going toward the right direction. Okay, again, these are averages, and we're looking at a large number of countries over 2000 to 2010. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us that it's more important to think about learning than just enrollment. Yes, we see in terms of enrollment, we nearly like more than 95% in total in 2010 were enrolled, but of course in this sample of countries. Okay, so this is different from what I showed you previously, because this depends on the sample of countries that you're looking at. So in this sample, 95% of the children are enrolled, but in the same sample, the learning actually is not going to the right direction. So actually, they're not doing this as well with the learning. So, as I said, this figure here is based on what they call harmonized learning outcomes, so HLO. Okay, and they have like a very interesting idea. Because to create like comparable statistics, you need students to attend to do the same assessment or to attend the same test. So, but this is difficult to do, because if you want this at a global scale, it's not easy thing to do. So what they thought to do is something called learning exchange rate, which is explained in detail in this paper. So please go and read that paper. But briefly, what that learning exchange rate does, or how they construct it, is based on comparing the scores for countries that participate in both assessments in the same subject. So if the same assessment, the same subject. So they focus on reading and math, I think. Okay, and they compare, of course, they take the average score in different countries if they have similar assessments, and then they use this to construct what they call the exchange rate. And then if we have two countries where one of them took, or students or children in one country took one assessment but the other didn't, then they can use the exchange rate to create or to adjust the results in the other country which didn't participate in the test to find out about the score if they have participated. So it's very, if you look at the calculation or the math itself, it's very straightforward. It's not very difficult. So there are a few equations in that paper which is very straightforward to understand. It's not really difficult, but this is the main idea, I think. Okay. So if we believe in their story that this is something that, of course, it has limitations, and there is a section on limitation as well. So explain the limitation about this, but this is not our concern at the moment. So our point here is this graph. So learning is different from from attending school. And this is, I think, everyone would agree with this, regardless of how accurate this is. Okay, so attending school doesn't mean that the child is learning. So anyway, so if we believe in this, then here's the map using the learning outcomes. So here is learning, not enrollment. So we're looking at learning. And the index goes, I think, the harmonized learning outcome, the HLO, goes from 300 to 625 is the scores. This dark blue, this is like the top. This light blue is the bottom of the score. So again, even without showing you that, it's something that you'd expect. Okay, so that tells you that learning in many African countries and Asian countries is just lacking behind. Okay, so this is consistent with the full picture that we see about development. Okay, so these countries are lagging behind, of course, because of the quality of human capital. And as I said, now we're looking at learning, not just enrollment. So actually, it's consistent with enrollment as well. Okay, but still, even those who are enrolled, they're not really receiving the good quality education that could help improving human capital and contribute to economic development. So just some remarks about what we saw now. So advanced economies obviously outpace developing economies in terms of human capital. Middle East performs similarly or worse than Latin America. So if you look at this area, it's either similar or even worse than Latin America. Many Asian countries outperform North American and European countries in terms of the quality of education or the learning. This shows like selected number of countries, just to show you, to tell you exactly, or to show you examples of what I just said now. So if we look at this, at the top here, or not at the top, the best, or the top of the list is Singapore, and this is like very close to 600. And as I said, this range from up to 600, so this is the maximum. And it is surprising to see Russia, for example, comes before United States in terms of learning. Remember, this is learning, okay? The HLO, the Harmonized Learning Outcome, okay? So that means the students or children in Russia perform better compared to, or score better, or get better scores than, or achieve better scores than children in the US at the same age, using this index, or this measure. So it's very surprising to see this, that Russia outperformed the US. Also, you see that Chile, for example, comes before some Eastern European countries like Georgia, so Latin American country, and a country like Saudi Arabia, where they have resources, they have the oil, but they're still near the bottom. So here's Saudi Arabia. So it comes before African, just very close to African countries in terms of learning. Again, remember, we're not looking at enrollment, we're looking at learning. Okay? So it's very, very surprising. The gap between Morocco and this selected group of countries, Morocco, and the top, which is, or the best performers in Singapore, is nearly the double. So this is nearly the double. It's like around 300, and this is around 600. Okay? So that tells you, yeah. Yes, yes, and then you get the average of the score. So let's say if you have 100 children doing the same test, okay, in country X, and whatever the number of children taking the same test in country Y, okay. So what you need to do in year whatever, 2010, for example. So you need to get the average score here and the average score here, okay. So and that is the idea. It's like these are like, sometimes averages are a bit misleading, but still it can tell us something about the story, okay? Yeah, so that's a really good question. So again, maybe I just didn't highlight this. So the way they construct the index, as I say, it goes from 300 to 600 or 250 to 600. It's the scores, the student scores, the average scores, okay? So, and again, the novel idea here is that when you have two countries didn't participate in the same test. So because if all countries did the same test, so we don't need this HLO then, because we're just gonna compare averages, okay? But the problem is that some countries participate, some countries do not. And then you want data set that cover most countries, so you are able to compare, okay, to make a comparison between different countries. So what is the main idea behind this is that if you can construct what they call the learning exchange rate, okay, so you can use this to apply this to countries that didn't participate in those tests, okay, and then you can, of course, they did some other different assessment or different tests, okay, and then you can convert these scores or adjust their scores to be comparable with the international test, okay, and that is the main idea. So once you do this, you can then rank those countries. As I said, Singapore seems to be in the top of the list, and what we're looking at here, we're looking at more than 160 countries, okay, so nearly all countries in the world, so looking at probably 90%, okay. So it seems to be like a very rich source. So if any of you interested to learn more about human capital, I would really advise to read this paper, and the data set is available as well from the World Bank database. Okay, so so these are just a very quick remarks about education, and as I said, education here, we are concerned more about learning, not just enrollment. Yes, I said in the past, most of the literature used to use enrollment, but we explain it's very clear that attending school doesn't mean that they are learning. When we look at learning indicators here, or the harmonized learning outcome, it shows very, very interesting result. But as again, if you go back to the map, it is something expected. Okay, so when you look at Africa or Asia, some parts on Asia, it is kind of expected. It's consistent with what we discussed in the other lectures. So this does the same, but more like per region, not per country like this one. It's very difficult to see different colors, but I'll try. So I think again, so this kind of, I think this one is like East Asian and Pacific, okay? This is Sub-Saharan Africa. So again, very, very low compared to enrollment. So in terms of enrollment, so it seems like most countries are doing okay, or doing well in terms of enrollment. Yeah, some countries still, some regions, sorry, still lagging behind. However, like you see, like the general trend is upward. So enrollment doesn't seem to be the main issue now, yet we still have children out of school, okay? So this is a big problem, still have children out of school. However, we see like the improvement over time is going well, so since 2000 till today. But when we come to learning, this is Sub-Saharan Africa, this is like East Asia, okay? And this is, I think this is Latin America, this one, yes, okay? So it seems like this is not consistent with this. So some countries, yeah, most countries or most regions are doing okay in terms of enrollment, but in terms of learning, again, it's not the same picture. And you can just read this paper for more details about this. So what is more interesting is, so now it's very clear that learning is different from enrollment, and learning might explain things related to growth, which we'll come back to this point. But there's something very, very interesting about girls and boys, because most of this literature usually try to compare between girls and boys. And the reason, as I said before, in most poor areas, they used to send only boys to school. So girls used to be at home just to help with the in the house. So there used to be like a gender gap, okay, between girls and boys in terms of enrollment, okay? So the interesting thing here is what they call flipped gender gap. And this is this data from 2010, but the index itself from 2017. So what we have here is, in the top, we have enrollment, and this is the gap between female and male, and this is, or girls and boys, and this in terms of learning. So we know this from before, that there is a gap, or there's some sort of bias against girls. So girls, in terms of enrollment, so they are lagging behind compared to boys in most in these regions. So South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, so all these negatives, so below that line, that means it's a negative gender gap. Okay, so it's below this 0. So you'll see this one is below 0, this one is below 0, this is the same, and most of these Latin America, East Asia and Pacific, again, so all these like negative gender gap. But when you compare this to learning, you see like learning, girls actually outperform boys in terms of learning. Okay, so maybe not this one, but if you look at MENA region, for example, so she is positive, Latin America is positive, Europe and Central Asia is positive, East Asia and Pacific is positive. So it's positive gap in favor of girls. So that means girls, they perform, so because this is like the scores, the test scores in terms of math and reading. Okay, so it seems that yes, there's a negative gap in terms of enrollment, but there's a positive gap in terms of learning. Okay, so some people might think this might be just a selection issue, which means only top performers or better performers girls join the school. So once they join, they are already good, but they show some evidence that this is not the case. Okay, so in general, and it's something I do believe myself, like I always like feel like girls, they take learning more seriously, okay, than us, than boys. So, but anyway, so they put some, they document some evidence in their paper about this sort of flipped gender gap. Okay, so the main point here is, okay, how is this related to GDP growth? Okay, remember, growth is not the whole story, but growth is important for development. So what they did here, they just tried to do like a very simple regression. We have the log GDP per capita to represent growth, and on the other axis is the harmonized learning outcome indicator or index. And these are different countries. We have high performing countries, low performing countries, and large developing countries. So what we see here, these are different like a selected number of countries. For example, Singapore, Poland, and Bulgaria, they all above that line. So this is the regression line. So meaning, so those countries above this line, so in terms of learning, they're actually doing better than what their income level would predict. Okay, so if you look at Singapore, Poland, Bulgaria, so they all above this line. So that means on average they are above average, or in terms of what we would predict using their income level. Okay, so this is not growth actually, this is just income level, log GDP per capita. Middle East and Africa, if you look at for example Kuwait, Qatar, they all Emirates, they all below that line. Okay, so again they actually, so the learning outcome here is below what we should expect given their income. Okay, so these top, so they actually have better learning outcome, more than what we would expect given their income. So the other ways, the story is the other way, with these countries below that regression line. Okay, China, if you compare China compared to similar large developing countries like India, or Mexico and Brazil. So China is doing much better. Okay, so learning outcomes in China doing much better than other large developing countries. Okay, so but in general, what is the main message from here? Just like if you just forget about the number of countries or the names of these countries. So this sort of positive relationship between GDP, so income level, and learning outcome. Yeah.
Communism promotes education. Clearly, China, Cuba, Vietnam.
That's
Communist regimes, so they all oppose that, which arguably you can make a theory about that.
actually they commented about that in the paper. Yes. So formerly or currently central planned economies like these Cuba, Poland, Bulgaria, they actually do much better. Yes. So it could be, as you said, that they promote education, maybe. Okay. But anyway, but it's more about, it's not just enrollment. This is more about learning. Okay. So that means they're doing better in terms of the HLO. Okay. But the main picture here, or the rather than just, if you just ignore the countries now, the trend here seems like positive relationship. So okay, so but it was really interesting to see these differences when you look at Singapore, Poland, and Cuba, and how they do better than what we would expect given their income. And on the other side, rich countries or high-income countries like Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait come actually below that line. So that means they actually the learning is below what we would expect given their income. So this is the conditional learning and how this affects economic growth. Okay, so conditional learning, because they condition it on the schooling as well, so attending school. Okay, and what we have here again, it seems like positive association between learning using the same index and economic growth. Okay, so I don't think we, even without seeing this is something you expect. Yeah, if you have a better quality human capital, so you'd expect higher growth rate. But what we have here is empirical evidence that show that. Okay, so my point is that this is consistent with our expectation. This is what you'd expect. Better human capital means higher growth rates, and this is exactly the empirical evidence. This is exactly what this evidence shows us. Okay, so it shows some sort of again, so this is regression between the growth condition or conditional learning, which means learning the condition giving that they attend school, of course. Okay, so this is something it's not very surprising, but again, as I said, it's kind of empirical evidence to show us this. I'm gonna finish with this table, which what they did, so they did the same thing, so they did the same regression, but in different regions. So what we have here in the first section here on this half, this is by current income status. So this is low income countries, lower income, upper middle income, and high income countries. And of course, they control for initial GDP, so how much income or the income level, GDP per capita, and also the years of schooling. So what we are interested in is the learning. So human capital is the part of learning. And these are the estimated coefficients. 0.7, 1.8, and obviously it seems all positive. So that means learning would increase economic growth, okay? However, what is really interesting is, what's more interesting is the magnitude of these coefficients, okay? How large or small these coefficients are. So when you look at the upper middle income, it's actually the highest. So what does this tell us? Again, so the bottom part saying that they control for all these these two factors, okay? So in all specifications. So we're not worried about this now. So this doesn't make any difference here because you control it in all these specifications. So what I'm looking at here is the sign, which is positive, which would expect. It's positive relationship. So learning increase GDP growth. But what I'm saying here is how large or small these coefficients are. Okay, 0.7, 1.8, 3.8, and then 1.7. So it seems the biggest one here is, the largest one is with the upper middle income. So what does this tell us? Between learning and GDP growth, and growth, because this is the dependent variable, is growth. Okay, so this is where you benefit the most from learning it at this level when in an upper middle income country. Okay, so that tells us something, that learning or education is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient, because at lower level here, or earlier level of development, low income countries, lower income countries, they have, well, there's positive association, but the magnitude or the effect is much smaller compared to middle income, to upper middle income country. And this is what they called, it seems like there is a sweet spot for investment in human capital. So it's most associated with growth as countries move from low, or the bottom, to the upper end of middle income status. So moving from here to here, so it seems like it's increasing. So the association here is the largest here, so this is or the correlation is the biggest here. So that means this is more statistically significant, if you want to say. So this is 3.8, and the error here, the standard error is 0.8, so smaller compared to this one. Yes. So it's more like a statistically significant. Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Okay. So again, it's just, this is like some observation they highlight, and of course, because at low income countries, they have issues with more like just human capital. There's problem with institutions as well. So other factors matter as well. So what this trying to suggest, what this is suggesting is, it's not only human capital, it's not only physical capital, it's not only, it's like the whole package. You need to think of institutions, you need to think of other factors too. Okay? So as I said, so this is the last thing I wanted to cover, and these are the two slides that you don't have on Learning Center, which I'm going to update the presentation with these two slides. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, there was like there were two slides. I just added like an hour before the lecture, and I thought it's something interesting to share with you. But as I said, I encourage you to read the paper. The full paper is very, very interesting. Okay, so from all what we said in the second half of the lecture, we all agree that learning is different from enrollment. What is more important is learning. We find we had like very recent evidence from the World Bank, and it shows that learning is associated, or strongly associated with economic growth. And again, obviously, this is something we would expect. This more or better quality education should boost or should lead to economic growth. Okay, so there are no surprises today. So everything probably we know, but we just show more evidence, more recent evidence about what we would expect. Learning is important for growth, or the quality of education is very important for economic growth. So as I said, so this is everything what we wanted to cover today. So we talked about human capital, what we mean by human capital, and as I said, when we talk about human capital, you need to think of health, education, skills. You need to think of experience. You need to think of habits, etc., knowledge and habits, etc. But what we talked about here is only one factor, was education. We didn't even fully cover it. We talked only about enrollment and learning and how this is related to economic growth. So this is everything we talked about today. Next lecture, we're going to move to the next block, Block E. We're going to talk about, start talk about trade, development aid, and foreign investment, and how these are related to economic development. And as I said, if you read chapter 7, you will have more details about what we discussed today, especially in terms of the return of education is important, is something really interesting you can read. Also other dimensions that we didn't talk about, like health, etc. So you might find more interesting details that we didn't cover today. Do you have any questions? Okay, so please, before you go, please rate the lecture and tell me what you think. Do appreciate your feedback.